So we won't go through this in huge detail, but you can see Pinot up at the top there, and it just says Pinot. Now, it could say Pinot Noir because Pinot Noir was the originator of all the other variants of Pinot. They are all mutations of the original Pinot Noir. But in fact, the scientists using DNA analysis have now worked out that all those other things like Pinot Blanc and Pinot Gris are genetically identical to Pinot Noir. They obviously look different. Some of them are white, some of them are black. But if you look at the DNA of what that makes them, they're genetically identical. So we're just going to call it Pinot as the kind of precursor of all the rest of this family tree or network rather than a tree. And you can see one of the most interesting crosses was Pinot Noir and this grape called GRIS. A GRIS Blanc, a white grape that is hardly seen anymore and was never an important grape in terms of wine, but for some reason it crossed very easily with Pinot Noir and created down this line of the network all of these other grape varieties, over 20 of them, including things like Chardonnay and Gamay and quite well-known grapes. Those are all directly offspring of GRIS and Pinot crossing. And these crosses, you can cross two varieties or within the same species of vine. You can cross two varieties together deliberately. And there are some wine grapes like that, like Pinotage, for example, in South Africa. There's a cross between Sanso and Pinot Noir that someone deliberately crossed to create something that they thought would suit their vineyard. But most of these crosses are wild. It's just the pollen from one plant has pollinated the flower of another plant, and the two have crossed. And so most of these, as I say, are historical crosses. And you can see also, if we go down this other leg from Pinot, there are some unknowns still. The DNA analysis says there must be another grape there yet to be identified, but we're starting to fill in all the blanks. And we can see that the Pinot family are also part of the family tree, one of the ancestors of everything from Tiroldigo and Garnaga and Catarato, a lot of big Italian grapes, down to things like Corvina, which makes Amarone and makes Valpolicella. And if we go along the way, again connected to Pinot, even down to things like Viognier and Syrah. So Pinot Noir crossing and its offspring crossing has led to this complex network of grape varieties, one of the most complex in the wine world. And Pinot means pine cone in French, taken from the shape of the bunch. And as it says, it almost certainly originated in Burgundy as Pinot Noir thousands of years ago. But like a lot of these very old varieties, it's genetically quite unstable. And what that means is it mutates quite easily. So that's why it turned itself into Pinot Gris or turned itself into Pinot Blanc or Pinot Meunier. These mutations that just happen naturally. It also morphs into these different expressions of the grape. So Pinot Noir, for example, morphs itself into all these slightly different variations of Pinot Noir, which become known as clones. Because someone has a vineyard and plants some Pinot Noir and notices that one vine produces fruit that's a little bit different from all the other vines. Maybe it's a little bit sweeter, maybe it accumulates a bit more sugar, maybe it's a bit more tannin, but they think that's a special, interesting vine. So they take cuttings from it, propagate them, and start a new clone, a new variant of Pinot Noir. And there are now hundreds of them, possibly about 1,000 different clones of Pinot Noir. You can see some of them here on this slide. And those again are an example of how this Pinot family is so interesting, because it mutates and it changes and it creates all of these variants, all of which are slightly different. It's one of the reasons that people who grow Pinot Noir in particular are so fascinated by it. So the family of Pinots, the main four grapes that are all mutations of the original Pinot Noir. We kick off with Pinot Blanc. I'm sure everyone's tasted Pinot Blanc in the past. In Alsace, it's thought of as the kind of everyday wine variety. You tend not to get particularly expensive Pinot Blanc, but it makes a nice, moderate style of wine without too much excitement. People say it's generally quite similar to Chardonnay, maybe not quite as distinctive. Easy to ripen, produces lots of fruit. So it's a kind of workhorse variety in a way for a place like Alsace. Also grown in Germany, where it's called Weissburgunder, white Burgundy. And it's popular in other places like Austria and Italy. And it sometimes sees some oak maturation or barrel fermentation, but generally made as quite a light style, also made into sparkling and sweet styles too. The second member of the family, which we're not looking at tonight, is Pinot Meunier. As it says there, a very important grape in Champagne, where it's a third of all plantings, basically. And it's very handy in Champagne because it ripens earlier than Pinot Noir does. So that means if there's a lot of rain comes at the very end of harvest and starts to kind of damage the crop, you might already have harvested your Pinot Meunier, so at least you've got some grapes in good quality. It's also more resistant to frost. And for that reason, it's seen as the kind of workhorse of Champagne. It's the bedrock of a lot of cuvées without ever being the star. It's the kind of really important member of the chorus line in terms of grape varieties in Champagne. Champagne does have 80% of the world's plantings. It's not planted much outside of Champagne, although there are some Pinot Noir Meunier grapes in the Loire and in Germany, making both sparkling wines and some still wines. And it's actually got a bit of a kind of cult following in Australia, in Victoria, near the Yarra Valley in Australia, and in California in the Napa Valley for making still wines. And you will see them, they're always expensive because it's a very kind of niche thing, but I've tasted a few and it makes very good wines, quite similar to Pinot Noir in those places. Next, we move on to Pinot Gris, one of our grapes for tonight. We'll talk about it a bit more just before we taste. Do, of course, have a taste of the wines if you're sitting watching patiently. You don't have to wait for me. So Pinot Gris or Pinot Grigio, exactly the same grape. It's just that Grigio is the Italian term, Gris tends to be the French term. And the wines do often have a slightly pink or copper tinge because, as you can see, the grapes are quite dark-skinned. Some of them go even darker than this, although still technically a white grape. And as a kind of shorthand, and you'll see labels around the world kind of using this shorthand, if you say your wine is a Pinot Gris, you're going for a slightly spicier, richer style of wine. And if you say your wine is Pinot Grigio, well, A, you might be in Italy, but if you're not, if you're in Australia making Pinot Grigio, you're kind of indicating that you're making a slightly lighter style of wine. As it says there, there's a lot of quite cheap, very light Pinot Grigio comes from the north of Italy, as well as some good ones. Tonight, we'll hopefully see that difference in our Pinot Grigio, which is a good quality one, and then our Pinot Gris from Argentina. We'll see that one is light, fresh, easy to drink. The other one is a little bit more rich, a little bit more weight to it, although still fresh and easy to drink with no oak. Then in Alsace, it's great kind of home. It makes everything from bone dry wines to fully sweet wines, the wines that Alsace calls SDGN, Sélection de Grains Nobles, or a selection of noble rotted grapes, botrytis grapes, similar wines made in Germany. And there are some regions in Italy making a more serious style of Pinot Grigio. Most of those ones up in the top northeast corner of Italy, north of Venice, in the Alto Adige, which is a Tyrolean part of Italy, and Friuli and Collio, which are on the Slovenian border, the very top right-hand corner of Italy. Quite a lot of planting of Pinot Gris now around the world. New Zealand's going for it in a big way in Marlborough, but also increasingly in Oregon and Washington and in other places. It's a grape that's finding quite a lot of favour at the moment. Then finally, of our quartet, Pinot Noir, undoubtedly one of the world's great grapes. A kind of holy grail for a lot of producers is to make a wine as good as the Burgundy original, because it's quite a sensitive grape, quite a fickle grape. It needs the right soil, it needs the right amount of water, the right sun, it needs the right terroir, the right earth, and it needs the right winemaking style to get the most from it. It's not just fundamentally, it's not as easy a grape to make a great wine from as something like a Cabernet Sauvignon or a Syrah, because it's a more temperamental variety. As you can see, it's the major grape of Champagne, as well as being obviously Burgundy's great grape. And it does make depending on the decisions that you make about not only planting and grape growing, but winemaking, it makes everything from really light coloured, floral scented, aromatic, light reds to quite deep and structured reds. And we'll talk a little bit as we go through next week in particular about what makes those differences to Pinot Noir when we look at 3 Pinot Noirs next week. Other hotspots around the world are listed there: Oregon, California, New Zealand Central, Otago, and an area, Marlborough is increasingly making a lot of very good Pinot Noir, and an area called Martinborough in the North Island also making very good Pinot Noir. Also in Australia, South Africa, and Chile, and other places that have traditionally made very good Pinot, but in smaller quantities, would be places like Germany, Italy, Switzerland, and Romania. So that's a family of grapes. Let us look now specifically at our 3 wines for tonight, our 3 white wines from Italy and Alsace and Argentina.